Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 10th of August 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, of course, Mike Robinson. Sunny day, that's the good news.
Yes, not so good news, balance of trade. And of course, this is one of the reasons why Brexit is such a nonsense, because apparently we're going to be held to ransom by the EU, despite the fact that that we're exporting more than we're importing. So this is figures according to HM Revenue and Customs, which is quite interesting because these figures appear to differ from those provided by the Office for National Statistics. So not quite sure which figures to believe, but this is at least what HMRC says. They say that in June 2017, the value of exports EU and non-EU decreased to £28.3 billion, and imports EU and non-EU increased to £41.7 billion compared to last month. These are the values for June, as I say. Consequently, the EU is a net importer for June, with imports exceeding exports by £13.4 billion. That is it. They say that there was a decrease of £1 billion compared to the previous month, but an increase of £3.6 billion compared with June 2016. So apparently we're doing a lot better. That's in terms of exports compared to a year ago, but not compared to a month ago. And imports, they increased by £1.3 billion compared to the previous month, and an increase of £1.8 billion compared to June 2016. So there you go. This apparently is the worst statistics since the Brexit vote. What more can we say?
Interesting, there's a discrepancy with the relative statistics. I think my mind come down to the Office for National Statistics being correct and a bit of manipulation with the other department, but maybe not.
Well, HMRC, I guess, is collecting VAT, so perhaps it is an interesting question as to why there's a difference, and I want to find that out.
Yeah.
Now, the Bank of England has announced its Future Forum, which is taking place later this year. This, of course, is the annual event. I think this is the third one they've held. They're going to be discussing what is the economy, why does it matter. Last year, apparently, people told the Bank of England that they need to help people understand the economy and the Bank of England's role better, particularly through education. So at this year's event, they're going to share their plans and would like public feedback to help shape what they do next. In partnership with Speakers for Schools, apparently, which is a UK-wide education charity that provides state secondary schools with free talks from high-profile figures. The bank's governors and chief economists are going to spend the morning visiting schools across Liverpool and speaking to students. And those sessions are going to include classroom-based activity that will also give the governors first-hand experience of how they can share their work with more young people. So they're clearly concerned about public relations and what people think about them and what people think about their work. Perhaps concerned about issues being raised over their independence.
Yeah, it's fascinating, this, Mike, because of course some years ago, excuse me, we had the financial services industry going into schools. So you would have insurance companies going in and talking to the children. And many people, of course, said this is very wrong because what these people are doing is not educating the children about the finance industry. They're sort of starting the placing of their products in front of very young minds. So fascinating. As you say, the Bank of England should now feel it needs to go into classrooms. And I think we might have a hint of why the Bank of England is getting nervous.
Just before we move on to other Bank of England subjects, I just wanted to throw this one in from the Telegraph, because and other mainstream media also pointing this out as well, that the Bank of England intends to keep animal fat in its banknotes. Now, this was recently they started producing plastic £5 notes, as you know, and a very small constituent within that was animal fat, and this caused a PR problem with vegetarians and vegans in particular. Well, the question is, to my mind anyway, what is going on here. That they have run a public consultation, and they've decided that despite the fact that less people were concerned about perhaps replacing the animal fat with palm oil, that they're going to stick with animal fat. I think this is, Brian, this is just an attempt to demonise cash, because of course they want to stop using cash altogether and move to plastic cards. But I would just ask the question, is there a proportion of plastic cards that also contain animal fat?
I think the answer to that is yes, Mike, and I think that was indicated in one of the articles I saw on this subject. But as you say, what is this? We've got all sorts of things to talk about, crises in the financial industry, and all of a sudden we're saying, oh, we've got animal fats. This seems to me to be a created story. It's a diversion, or it's a message.
Yeah. Demonising cash.
Demonising cash, right. Well, why should the Bank of England be a little bit worried about reputation? This was fascinating BBC report here. Bank of England covered up failed World War I loan deal. And I'm going to thank Nick Green for sending us through the initial pointer to this article, because it's got more and more interesting. So apparently the government wanted to use a loan to raise, this is to do with bonds, to raise 350 million to fund the First World War. And articles in the Financial Times claimed it had been oversubscribed. So what they're really talking about there is that the government got into trouble. Let's see if we can do this in simple terms. The Financial Times lied to the public in what was actually happening. But as we're about to see, it suggested that the Bank of England came in to rescue it, because it goes on. But the loan raise was less than a third of its target, and the Bank of England was asked to help find the rest. So the good old Bank of England might came in to help find the rest of the money.
So what's fascinating about this, Brian, is that we're seeing a case here of fake news, because we're talking about 1913-14. They attempted to raise money by issuing bonds, £350 million, and war bonds these were. And the war bonds issue was so undersubscribed, they only raised a third of the amount of money that they needed. But the Financial Times published some fake news, telling everybody that it was all fine, it was all oversubscribed. Right,
and the Bank of England helped cover up the reality as well. But the spin is that actually it was the Bank of England that came in and saved the day. Well, if you follow through on this article, and encourage people to go and read it, you find a link which takes you through to this blog. This is Bank Underground, and this is apparently a blog run by Bank of England staff, and on it they can put opinions. The opinions are their own, not the Bank of England's. But here is more of the article. Your country needs funds, the extraordinary story of Britain's early efforts to finance the First World War. And this is an extraordinary site. Do go and have a look at it. I just selected part of the article to emphasise what they're talking about. But here we are as part of a project looking at the financing of World War I. The ledgers of investors who purchased the 3.5% war loan have been analysed for the first time. These reveal the startling truth about the failure of the first bond issue of the Great War and the extraordinary role of the Bank of England in covering and then concealing the shortfall in funds. So here we've got the mixed messages again. The good old Bank of England came in to help save the day, but it was a little bit naughty, and that it also helped to conceal the funds. So how did this research come about? Well, this is where the story starts to get particularly interesting. If you go on further down the blog, you can come into some of the detail here. So we've got Mike Anson, works in the Bank's archive. Norma Cohen is a PhD student at Queen Mary University of London. Alastair Owens is Professor of Historical Geography at Queen Mary University of London. And Daniel Todman is a senior lecturer in history at Queen Mary University of London. And there's a whole lot of references there. And there is another part to the website which is very fascinating. Encourage you to go and have a look at that. The point we're coming to is the fact there's no mention of the Bradbury. So the major event around the First World War and money was the Bradbury pound, but just at this precise moment, we've got the Bank of England's not private, but its staff blog now coming up with a story to do with a relatively minor sum of money around these war bonds. It says that we're grateful to the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council for supporting our research, and then it gives the award number. And obviously money has changed hands. Well, we spoke to the Arts and Humanities Council this morning to see if we could actually find out how much money was paid for this Bank of England research. We couldn't get a direct answer. They've promised they're going to come back to us with some information on that. But we're very curious to see if we can establish who actually requested the money to do this research and what the purpose was. So this is the top header of the blog itself, Bank Underground. And if you scroll down until you come to comments, I'm delighted to say that one of the comments you are going to find is from Justin Walker from the British Constitution Group. And he's posted here, can you please explain to me this chapter of Thomas Johnson's book, The Financiers and the Nation, and his description of the Treasury-issued Bradbury pound, and why you don't mention the enormous success that this fiscal arrangement was to fund Britain's war effort. So Justin Walker has gone straight in there and asked the key question, how is it you could research the raising of money to fund the First World War, but you don't mention the Bradbury pound? Mike, when I saw this article, is this just a coincidence that at the time the pressure over the Bradbury is increasing, that this is pure coincidence that the Bank of England has done this? Or we've now got the situation, the Bank of England is looking to go in to speak to school children, and we're now also got a smokescreen to get people's attention off the Bradbury. I don't know. But some heavyweights behind the article itself. This is Professor Alastair Owens from Queen's Mary University. I called him briefly this morning and said we were surprised they weren't covering the Bradbury. He's referred me to the other lady who was doing the PhD, that was Ms. Cohen, and we're going to wait and see whether we can get in contact with her and ask why hasn't the Bradbury been mentioned. Dr. Dan Todman was one of the other heavyweights being used, but I couldn't manage to get through to him on the phone. So at the end of the day, money changing hands, and this is where it's come from. Just fascinated by this page from the Arts and Humanities Council, industry and university partnerships to power a creative revolution. Is this what's coming, Mike? Do you think a revolution powered by
all kinds of partnerships? Actually.
All kinds of partnerships, but of course money drives it.
Yeah.
And if you want to know about how much money, then you can have a look on the Arts and Humanities Research Council website and see the information for yourself. They'd got this infographic showing where grant money had gone. Obviously UK is there on the left, but I was very surprised to see the reach of British grant money on worldwide projects. So are they working on revolution across the world?
So this is more soft power at work then?
More soft power, which fits in nicely with a little bit later in the news. So we'll remind people, if you're not familiar with the Bradbury pound, you might care to go and have a look at the British Constitution Group that's looking at the Bradbury in context with constitutional matters. And if we go here to the UK column website and you scroll down the front page, you'll come to this link, which if you click on it, it's going to take you through to the Bradbury ebook, and you can read for yourself. And I'll just add in here, the start of that ebook is giving you a variety of statements from bankers, including Mr. Rothschild, who said he didn't care what puppet was placed on the throne of England if he controlled the money. So interesting statements there, and a UK column, a lot of additional information on the Bradbury pound. I think there's some dark arts at work here, Mike, and I think we're going to see an increasing reluctance of the government or government departments, the Treasury and the Bank of England, to talk about the Bradbury pound.
Okay, let's talk about the bankers' other favourite pastime, which is war and so on. And of course, the pressure in the United States over Russiagate continues, but at least one mainstream news outlet in the US, The Nation, has published this article. A new report raises big questions about last year's DNC hack. This is The Nation. They have published a coverage of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity exposure of Russiagate. Of course, they were making the point that this material, which appeared to show collusion with Russia, has not come from a Russian hack. It has come from leaks provided to WikiLeaks. The author of this piece is Patrick Lawrence, who's an historian and a journalist. And he had interviewed 4 of the primary members of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. He began with a warning of the nature of how serious the situation was. He called this an intelligence fraud. This is, of course, another dodgy dossier. And he covers earlier intelligence frauds, for example, the Yellowcake fraud. And he says at the end, the investigators deserve a response. The betrayed professionals who formed VIPS as the weapons of mass destruction scandal unfolded in 2003 deserve it. And so do the rest of us. The cost of duplicity has rarely been so high. So at least one mainstream news outlet absolutely calling this for what it is. And in the meantime, then, RT reporting that contractors in the US, 2 psychologists who were paid $80 million to create the torture program for the CIA, which I guess was used at Abu Ghraib and other places, certainly used as a result of rendition, are facing a court case. The court case is being brought, it's a jury trial being brought by the American Civil Liberties Union on behalf of 2 people that were 3 former detainees, and this is being brought against James Mitchell and John Jessen. So we wait to see how that turns out. But
this has got to be good news, Mike, in my opinion, because from some of the material I've read, I believe that at least one of those psychologists was present at some of the torture taking place. So it's not a question that they devised something in theory. From what I've read, the indications are that at least one of these individuals was actually present when people were being tortured. And I think it's very important that we keep using the word torture because, of course, the British government has been implicated in this and has consistently sidestepped the issue. Well, we did know some of it was going on, but of course, we didn't really know. So perhaps who would be next in the firing line? Mr. Blair, possibly.
Well, with any luck, we'll be coming on to him a little bit later. Now, it is fascinating to see how one of the other sort of people at one of the other countries, which is going to be at the end of this this pressure for war, is China. Of course, China moving ahead unbelievably quickly with new technologies and infrastructure development around the world. But of course, one of the issues that they've been working on is how do they communicate with each other in a secret way, because of course encryption ultimately can be broken. But they have been looking, we've mentioned this before, been looking at quantum communication technologies, and they launched a satellite, I think about 12 months ago, to investigate quantum communications. And they are now claiming that they have succeeded in the 3 main challenges that they set themselves for this technology. They've published in various scientific journals as they've gone. So they say that they have achieved 3 preset scientific goals ahead of time since the launch in August 2016. and the satellite, which is called MOSI in Chinese, after the ancient Chinese philosopher and scientist. He is credited as the first person to conduct optical experiments, and of course this is based on optical technology. And they say that they are now intending to use this satellite system to cover the planet by 2030 with this technology. It's allegedly uncrackable. I suppose that still has to be tested, but if the data stream is in the form of point-to-point light, and laser light, and it can't be intercepted in between, I'm not quite sure how it's possible to crack it.
It's going to be interesting. I think some of this is also giving us an indication of the advances that have been made with the Russians, and I would imagine with collaboration with the Chinese on their electronic warfare in general, which the American general described was eye-watering.
And finally, and perhaps most disturbingly, USA Today is covering this, a number of other places as well. The Trump White House is how it's being described, but it's actually not the Trump White House at all. But they're looking at a plan to privatize the war in Afghanistan. So basically this is coming from one individual. McMaster and Jim Mattis apparently do not agree with this plan. But the one individual is saying that the best way to move forward with this is to get the US military out and put in private contractors instead. Does that seem reasonable?
Well, it seems reasonable to me, Mike, if your objective is to maximise the drug money and to have it in one sort of global company criminal cabal. You have everything.
Okay, and so if I was to tell you that the person who's proposing this was part of Blackwater, in fact helped found Blackwater, would that suggest a conflict of interest?
That would all fit quite nicely, but of course we're seeing this everywhere. They're talking about doing this on the ground. They've been doing it on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan, out of sight of the public. We're now just saying we're going to expand that operation and make it the norm. If we come to drone strikes, who's actually flying the drones? We've no idea at the moment.
Yeah, so just to clarify, the person that's proposing that is Eric Prince. He says it's going to cost less than $10 billion a year, and that's perfectly good value for money. But I have to say, it kind of reminded me of the situation of the British East India Company, for example, where that organisation had a larger private army than national governments at the time.
Yeah.
So what did they go and do? Well, they basically sent their private armies in and looted countries, really. That was the business model.
So nothing has changed.
Moving back to, yeah, indeed.
Nothing has changed. Well, perhaps we should consider full privatisation of procurement of aircraft. I've been a little bit naughty here because this is a semi-satirical article, but I'd say go and have a read of it because I'm sure there's some substance in it, and there's certainly a bit of humour. But basically the article is saying that the F-35 is now suffering even further setbacks because, according to Washington, program and officials have acknowledged that the aircraft's current data processor is operating at maximum capacity, and an updated processor with increased capacity is likely to be needed for the first increment of Block 4 to function as intended. So what that really means is that it's not functioning at the moment. It might function in the future, but even more money to be spent on this aircraft. And of course, let's remind ourselves that we've had child nursery expert Michael Fallon grinning and as he's on board our aircraft carrier, which might get 3 of these aircraft at some stage in the future.
Well, 3 of these aircraft by next August is what he's claiming.
Yes.
Do you believe that?
With an overstressed processor. It's not looking good.
No, and a reputation for trying to kill its pilots. Some people think that we're very unfair on the poor old F-35, but to me, Brian, the obscene amount of money that has been spent on this, and for what? An aircraft that doesn't perform as well as the F-16 in most
Well, the whole point
situations.
of the F-35 project, Mike, is that it's making procurement across national boundaries. This is getting rid of the nation states and getting rid of defence industries in nation states, and everybody is coming into this global collective military. So I think the F-35 is not about the aircraft itself. It's about drawing in countries to this global procurement system.
So for Fallon and his ilk, it doesn't matter how much it costs then?
No,
No.
because that's only a secondary part of the agenda. Luckily, neither of us is flying on an F-35 for holidays.
Well, I'm not flying at all, thankfully, but because I'm not too keen on going through airports these days. But anyway, that's beside the point. We are going to be on holiday for the next couple of weeks. So tomorrow will be the last UK column news until the 31st of August. And of course, just a reminder that because this falls, the monthly meeting falls during this period, there will be no UK column monthly meeting in the George in Plympton this month. So the next one will be the third Wednesday of September. Well, we had hoped to do this tonight, but for various technical reasons, we weren't able to. But Ian Crane will be in the studio live tomorrow night for Humanity versus Insanity at 7:30 and Fracking Nightmare at 9 p.m. More on the injunction that we covered from INEOS yesterday and Fracking Nightmare tomorrow, so do watch that if you get the chance. So that's tomorrow, Friday, ukcolumn.org/live. Now, the Commonwealth. We covered this, I think, back in November or so, but the Commonwealth, according to Dominic Asquith, who's the British High Commissioner to India, the Commonwealth encourages mainstreaming into member state policies of women's leadership, gender equality, and the empowerment of women. That sounds pretty good. And alongside that, in India, we had the Great Scholarships Programme India, 198 great scholarships to Indian students being run by the British Council. And on top of that, we had Chevening, which is the UK government's international awards scheme aimed at developing global leaders, Chevening scholarships. And of course, who runs Chevening scholarships? But once you run through this all, you discover that it's run by Common Purpose, our old friends. So why are we mentioning this now? Because Lord, I do apologise, Lord Ahmed.
I've already done one of those so far.
Okay.
So we just say to our audience, it's due to the fact we have to work on a budget of less than 3.74 billion,
yes,
which
indeed.
the BBC uses.
Okay, so anyway, this is Lord Ahmed, and he did actually say this. The Commonwealth has huge potential to increase its global influence, and he was saying basically because we're going to be hosting a big event next year on how the Commonwealth can increase its global influence. But he also had this to say. I welcome the fourfold increase in the number of Chevening scholarships since 2014. And what he was talking about, Brian, was in Bangladesh, because he was in Bangladesh pushing out the same agenda, common purpose driven agenda, in Bangladesh, as they have been recently pushing out in India and other places. And really, I brought this up. We'll be coming on to Common Purpose a little bit later, but the point here is that through Chevening scholarships, the British Council and other similar types of leadership award schemes, they are pushing Common Purpose dogma and rhetoric into countries which might be considered developing countries, and it raises cause for concern as to what the outcome for that would be for those countries.
Well, I think the outcome is quite clear, Mike. The aim is to undermine whatever the existing culture is and replace it with the wonderful culture that we can now see emerging in the Western world. And I think I'm also right in saying that the British Council is the parent organisation of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which we've just mentioned as paying for that money to do with the Bank of England article.
Right.
So British Council, what is it really? Soft power of the British government.
Yep.
Well, let's come in at a different angle. We reported about a week ago that we were getting very concerned because people were telling us about events in Sheffield where the children of immigrant families were being targeted by Sheffield Social Services, supported by the police. They were taking children, they were certainly taking children away from protective parents, whether that was the mother or the father, and the child ultimately being taken away for fostering or given to the abusive parent. Now, what I want to say is we've had a steady stream of information coming in on this, but we still can't report fully because of an ongoing court case. But we've now got other individuals who've come forward as a result of our reports, talking about this being a template aimed at immigrant communities or the children of immigrant communities, which is taking place in other areas. So this is what is being reported through to the UK column, and I can assure you that we've done enough research today to know that the people contacting us are telling the truth about what they're seeing. This is the image, though, that the mainstream press are trying to put across. So we've got Sarah Champion in a Telegraph article, and she's on the subject of Pakistani and Asian men. She said people are more afraid to be called a racist than they are afraid to be wrong about calling out child abuse. We've got now hundreds of men, Pakistani men, who've been convicted for this crime. Why are we not commissioning research to see what is going on and how we can change what is going on so that it never happens again? If such crimes were being committed by, for example, a motorbike gang, we would recognise that as an indicator, and we would deal with it. Now, I think this lady's heart is in the right place, but I think she's utterly falling into the trap which is being set, which is that the only cases which are being brought to court at the moment, or the majority of the cases being brought to court, are heavily focused on Asian gangs. Absolutely correct, those men are abusing the children, but in the background we have massive abuse of children, white children, Christian, Asian, all sorts of children, which is being carried out by the local authorities themselves with the help of the courts and the police. And of course, none of this is being reported. Neither are we seeing any investigation into the reports of abuse within the walls of Westminster. So I think the agenda here, Mike, is from the mainstream press. They are using the child abuse issue as another stick in order to try and deflect people into hatred between race or religion.
I'm going to say that's absolutely right. This was the front page of the Daily Mail this morning. How many more girls' lives torn apart by sex gangs? Now, look, Brian, it is a fact that we have been criticised quite often in the past of our coverage of this subject. We've been accused of glossing over the fact that these sex gangs are mostly Asian and Muslim. We've even been accused of apologising for them, which of course, as you've just said, we absolutely are not. But what we are doing is trying to encourage people to focus on why these gangs are allowed to operate, because they are being allowed to operate. Who's behind the cover-up of this activity? Because until we deal with that question, we can't find any permanent fix to the issue of sex gangs, whether they're Muslim or otherwise. So again, I urge people to read our Common Purpose Effect series of articles written by Martin Edwards mainly, and absolutely superb articles. If you want to understand how this is happening, you've got to understand that. And let me also remind you of this article from the BBC, Why Wasn't Mother Warned of Paedophile? This was on the BBC website a few days ago, which highlighted the fact that it was Thames Valley Chief Constable Sarah Thornton who had covered up for the child abuser at the centre of this story. And this is the same Sarah Thornton, as we mentioned last week, who systematically covered up the abuses at Oxford and Cherwell Valley College, which we were working on bringing to the public domain since 2011, and this particular article appeared in 2013. And this is the same Sarah Thornton who's now head of the National Police Chiefs Council. So this woman has questions to answer. Common Purpose has questions to answer, because if you look at the places where the grooming and the sex gangs were operating, we find a massive Common Purpose presence among the people who were making the decisions about whether people were to be prosecuted or were turning a blind eye in many cases. And you've got to ask the question, was this intentional or was it not? Were they permitting this activity to take place or were they not? Were they permitting it to take place because of some future date? It would give them the opportunity to encourage people to look in the direction of Muslims rather than looking in their own direction. Yeah. There are lots of questions to be answered here. And let's just get back to Sarah Thornton, chairwoman of the National Police Chiefs Council. And of course, one of her colleagues is the Chief Constable of Northumbria Police. And the news is full of this story today, because this is an incredible situation where the Northumbria Police recruited a child rapist to spy on parties where the police believed that underage girls would be present and would be abused. And even the NSPCC has come out and said that this situation beggars belief. So this child rapist informant was paid £10,000 by the police to assist the investigation. The Chief Constable claims that this man was not committing any offences in the process of the work that he was doing for the police. You know, I'm almost speechless in the situation we're in at the moment, Brian, where we have cover-up after cover-up and evidence after evidence, but we don't look at Parliament, we don't look at the police, we don't look at local councils and social services and common purpose. Instead, we look at Muslims and
Asians.
And the Asians, if they've committed an offence, they get taken to court and they get convicted and they go to prison. That's absolutely right. But this will continue to happen until we start looking at the source of the problem.
Indeed. We just put that slide back on screen, Mike. What struck me with this headline is of course the comment is from NSPCC. We know from survivors of child abuse that many of those survivors highly suspicious of charities like NSPCC. They say don't trust them, they're too close to the abuse going on. And when we asked the Metropolitan Police why they were using NSPCC to answer their numbers on Met Police websites, so if you called in thinking you were speaking to the police, you were actually put through to the NSPCC. So no separation of powers here, Mike.
No. And just as a closing comment on the Chief Constable for Northumbria, you'll always find the common purpose. He is really keen to achieve a common purpose with partners. And this is the key problem. It's this common purpose with partners. This is what allows the cover-up to take place, because, as you say, no separation of powers. And this is a heading from Northumbria Police accounts, ensuring the force and partners work together to achieve a common purpose with clearly defined functions and roles. It seems to me that the clearly defined functions and roles, at the core of that is the words cover-up.
Indeed. And of course, several years ago, you and I and another lady were in one of the police stations in Plymouth, Charles Cross, if I remember correctly, reporting that a little baby boy was being abused, not sexually, but neglected as the abuse in South Wales, and far from being received with care, concern, interest. We had a sergeant in that police station shouting at us in a very aggressive way. In fact, we were told to get out of his interview room. Clearly, he was not interested in any evidence about the abuse of children. I could almost feel now, Mike, looking back at that incident, that particular officer was scared of the information we had. Well, yesterday we were talking about Devon and Cornwall Police, Sergeant Tangy tweeting out boasting that he'd been travelling at 140 miles an hour on his way to a crime scene with no crime. Somebody sent us this one through. Just fascinating. This is how this policeman sees himself. So we've got him dressed as Rambo. What is this? This outfit itself is clearly designed to be intimidating. Rambo, world warrior, dressed in black. This is how this police officer sees himself. Is he there to protect the public and children? I think he's on a totally different trip.
Certainly on a different planet, but he looks very like one of the guys that was running an exercise in the building across the street from the UK Column offices last year, about this time last year. I wonder, was he part of that little exercise?
He could well be, because he boasts on his Twitter page that he's part of the armed response training team. So perhaps he was one of the individuals that chose to run an armed response right outside the UK Column studio.
So we'll end with the BBC again then, because another day, and they never give up on the opportunity to propagandize for Tony Blair. They ran this program live at 9 a.m. this morning. It's on the iPlayer now, but of course, these days you've got to sign in with a login name and a password in order to get access to it. So they ran this morning, hosted by Peter Hennessy, who gushed over Blair in his introduction. Well, here's what he had to say. Here's this guy Trotsky, who was so inspired by all the things they were talking about just prior to that he went out to create a Russian revolution and change the world. I think it's a very odd thing. Just literally, it was a light going on, the insurgents. So anyway, he was basically explaining what a great time, or how great he was, or how great he thought Trotsky was. He said he was a Trotskyite for a short time. You know, it amused me that Trotsky was the particular revolutionary that was chosen, since that was the particular revolutionary that had received so much money from J.P. Morgan and other Wall Street bankers in order to run the revolution in the first place. Here's Tony Blair, who also receives huge quantities of money from J.P. Morgan and other Wall Street bankers to do the same kind of thing. When is this man going to be? When do we see him being put out of our misery? That's what I want to know.
Well, I don't know, but I'll just end by saying that the day after he was originally elected, I spoke to one of my neighbours at the time, who was a very elderly farm hand. That had been his job since starting at the age of 14, looking after Shire horses. And I asked this gentleman what he thought of Tony Blair, and he said to me straight away, "The man is utterly evil." And I was a bit surprised, and I said, "How can you say that?" And he said, "Brian, I've worked with animals all my life, and I know when you get a bad one." And I think that elderly gentleman could see something at that time that I couldn't fully see. We'll end there. Thank you very much for joining us. And as we always say, please don't just sit and listen to the information that UK Column gives. We hope that you'll help spread that information. And as the state is now starting to close down free media sites, or at least restrict their reach, we need the help of our audience to help spread the information that we're putting out. So don't sit and do nothing. Please spread the information we're giving you, and do something. Action conquers fear. Thanks for joining us. Our last news will be tomorrow before a break for the summer period. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.